Gary, is there another interpreter on that I'm not seeing?
I know Beth is going to be coming. She was just finishing up another meeting we were in.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll ask either you or Joey to notice her because I probably won't if I'm talking. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. It's time to get started. I'm Paula McElwee, and I'll introduce myself a little bit more in just a second when I start the slides. I do want to make an announcement first about how we are doing this call. So we are actually putting this call together on with a short PowerPoint presentation. And we'll have the first part of our conversation around the topic recorded, and it will be posted when we finish that part of the call. That's letting you know that any of your questions in the chat or in person, until we turn off the recording, will be included in the posted copy of this call. So if you have something that's sensitive that you don't want to say in front of everyone else, we understand that. And you can hold that for after we turn off the recording in 20 minutes or so, maybe longer. We'll see. So that's just an announcement for you all. Let me start the slideshow for you. I can figure out how to share this screen. I always have this fun time starting it. Here we go. All right. We're going to talk about transportation today. Transportation and IL, which is an interesting topic to me because my reality is that I go way back in NIL, way back. And I remember our conversations as a network from the beginning about what are the barriers for people to live the life that they want to live. And our reality is that those barriers include the same things today that they included back in the day. And so when we sat around the tables and talked about barriers, transportation came up in 1980, and transportation came up in 2024. It is a very real barrier for people who want to go where they want to go and do what they want to do. And it's interesting to me that we have still not totally resolved that barrier. So we're going to talk a little about whether or not centers for independent living have a role in meeting transportation needs and what that role might be. Now, this is presented to you by ILNet. ILNet is a group of partners. ILRU is probably the website you're most familiar with, and that's where this will be posted. We also partner with APRIL, the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, and NICL, the National Council on Independent Living, and the University of Montana as partners in presenting to you technical assistance and training on all kinds of topics. And this is a topic you picked at our last monthly meeting. And so we're going to talk about that. As I said, I'm Paula McElwee. I'm the Director of Technical Assistance for ILNet. I'll give you a very brief physical description. I'm an older woman with silver hair and Scottish complexion, and I'm working out of my home office. So you can imagine me there. And I do want to make one other announcement before we get started, and that announcement is that we have something exciting coming up. So this is our September 17th and 18th CIL Philosophy and Practice Summit. So it's not a webinar exactly. It's a meeting. There are 4 sessions. There will be some presentations, some discussions, some other kinds of ways to be involved in this intensive 2-day learning conversation and plan of action. And so I hope that all of you will take time. There's a QR code on the screen. You can photograph that and go to the registration. Registration is free. And we're also hoping that you'll get a group of people together in your community to participate in this conversation. That might include consumers, staff, management, board, whoever you feel is interested in setting the direction for the future for your center. So we hope that you will take the time to do that. And here's what we're going to discuss today. I'm sorry, this call can only be an emergency. So let me just do this very quickly. I'm on a call. Is this an emergency? Okay, hi.
Note that.
Yes, it wasn't an emergency. Sorry about that. It's my husband who's outside moving stuff around. I was afraid something fell on him. So what we're going to discuss today is transportation and where might a CIL provide or be involved in transportation? Is this a rural issue only? Is it an urban issue too? Are there other factors that we need to take into consideration when we look at this? And what are the appropriate roles for a CIL related to transportation in providing it directly, maybe advocating for access to transportation, maybe related to paratransportation rather than mass transit? So what are some of those roles? And before we get into this discussion, I just want to tell you my story about transportation. So as I said, it was an issue from the beginning, right? And there was a group of people in our community who actually started our center, but before they started our center, they started a transportation service. 1 van, paratransit, little community of about 15,000 people, and provided door-to-door transportation with volunteer drivers and so on and so forth. Well, it became obvious to us that transportation was so in demand that it needed to expand. So that group of people and the new Center for Independent Living that had just been started got together with the entity that owned the most vehicles in our community, and that was a DD agency. They had group homes, and each home had a vehicle attached to it. And they had other transportation, that they had done for medical reasons or other things for that group of people that they provided residential services to. And so the center and the consumer group went to them and said, let's do community-wide transportation. And that's what we did. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of details on that, but I'm going to share in the chat the link to what that looks like. It became 18 county transportation, people coming from other areas into the main city where the medical services were on a planned basis. It has been very successful, has spun off to be its own thing. So I just wanted to share that with you because I think it's interesting and I think you might find that link of use to you. So there it is. Now, all right, so where might a CIL provide or be involved in transportation? I hope any of you that have transportation will jump into this conversation as we go along today. And any of you who are thinking about trying to figure out ways to do transportation, I hope you'll jump in with your questions because this really is a very big issue. Maybe some times of the year people can be self-propelled around their community if they live in a small enough town and they have accessible enough sidewalks But the reality here in Fresno, California is that it's been over 100 degrees every day for the last month. Now, yesterday we got a break, it was only 99. People have no business being self-propelled at certain times of the day. And those times of the day are the times of the day when most medical appointments happen, right? In the middle of the day, not early and not late, but in the middle of the day. So a reality is that in the summertime, sometimes being self-propelled is not useful. Self-propelled meaning walking, pushing your own chair, so forth. The same thing is true in the wintertime where a lot of you live. The walks and roads are not cleared early enough for you to be self-propelled, even if you can dress up warmly enough to manage the weather. So transportation is a real issue that a center might be involved in. In rural areas, that can include medical transportation, and there's separate funding for medical transportation. So sometimes that's advantageous for people. Sometimes it has to do with collaborating with other people who provide transportation. We'll talk about some of the challenges around taxis and Uber and Lyft. Challenges being that individual drivers make a lot of their own decisions about things and may or may not be fully accessible, but it still is an option for us to look at as we look at transportation. Cooperative agreements with others who have vehicles, like the AAAs, the area agencies on aging, sometimes have vehicles in rural areas. As I mentioned earlier, the intellectual and developmental disability providers often have vehicles that are attached to some of their housing options that they assist with. So that might be a part of it. In urban areas, they may have mass transit, fixed route, bus stops, all of that, but there still needs to be planning on where they go. You still have to be able to get to them. I remember going to a conference one day, and this was an early nickel conference, and this was the topic, because it continues to be the topic because it still isn't resolved, right? And I remember the argument was going on about whether you needed special transportation or mass transit. And the person who was presenting said, just get your butt down to the bus stop and get on the bus. How else are we going to get transportation to become accessible if we're not using it? And I thought, well, it's a good argument until you need it now. And you've got to go through all the advocacy that has to happen for mass transit to work. It can, but it's a lot of work. It takes planning. Often driver training is a part of that, because the drivers don't know what to do. They don't know how to run the lift. They don't know how to do the tie downs. They don't know how to do a lot of stuff. And so there are times when we have a role to play, even in mass transit. Even though we're not going to operate it, we have a role to play as advocates. Now, Anthony posted in the chat, we don't do transportation. We were thinking of doing something along that lines, but the funding and the logistics were not there yet. We do have a local transportation organization for people with disabilities, but I've heard where they're not very good, unfortunately. And isn't that our reality sometimes, is that we're dealing with transportation that is not effective, is not truly a part of our community and a part of our solutions for living independently. Now, the Department of Transportation, that's true in each state. Each state has its own Department of Transportation, right? And the Department of Transportation has grants. It's flowed from the federal level for vehicles. And if you don't know or aren't aware of that, that's something for you to be aware of. They pay the majority, 80% of the cost of the a vehicle, it's an accessible vehicle, it takes a long time from the application to the delivery of the vehicle. So if you are doing this kind of process, you need to remember that, oh, I need to get another vehicle going, right? I need to get another application started because this vehicle will be over 100,000 miles before I get the next one. So you have to have a system in place to work continuously to make this happen. But this is available. And some centers do use these to provide transportation. Sometimes that's from one community to another. And so they meet everybody at one office and they, load up the people who want to go to that community to shop or to see medical services. And then they take them home again at the end of the day. And so Tuesdays they go from Hill City to Hayes, and Wednesdays they go from Atwood to Colby, and Thursdays they go from, so on and so forth. So some centers provide that kind of service using these vehicles on fixed route transportation. There is money for medical transportation. And so you can become a provider, you can sign up and do this. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for all the rest of the transportation we need in life. So typically, the only way that this has been funded is through cities or counties who want to fund some kind of transportation. Most of them have a council or a transportation, a department or a planning department. And centers can be involved in maybe not providing direct transportation, but facilitating the provision of it, getting the cities and counties to buy in, getting them to realize, hey, this isn't just people who use wheelchairs. This is everybody who can't drive anymore. And so this includes older people, and often you can get a buy-in from the AAA or from some of those aging organizations as partners with you to see that transportation is provided in your community. Now, some centers use these same vans for on-demand or paratransit from one person's door to the destination, and then the person calls and they get the return trip. The difficulty here is not just the operation of the vehicle, but also the operation of a dispatcher. Because as soon as you leave fixed route and go to on-demand, then you have to have a way to know the demands. So you have to have some kind of a system for scheduling rides to provide that transportation. So kind of keep that in mind. And I'm curious about what you all know about transportation being provided directly by centers and what that looks like. Now, Catherine posted in the chat that as a statewide advocacy group, we looked at what it would take to get an accessible van at each CIL, but logistics and insurance were the issues. We have 2 CILs that provide on-demand paratransit, but they run into issues with driver retention and funding. Service is not a one that makes money. Yeah, you've got to figure out how to raise the money, do the resource development. But it is an area that is important to people's independence. And it is an allowable area with your federal grants. Now, your federal grants haven't been increased much for a long time. And so that means not doing something else if you're going to put money into this. I mean, it's not self-sustaining unless you go into your city or county and get your local municipalities to somehow buy in. Well, what do you all know about transportation being provided directly by centers? Is it happening anywhere? You mentioned insurance and other operation costs, and some of those costs are sometimes also paid for by the Department of Transportation. You have to look at what their grants can include, but some of them can include operations costs as well as the purchase of the vehicle. So watch those, pay attention, and see what else comes flowing out when the time comes. What do you all know about transportation with centers? Put it in the chat or jump into the conversation. We've only got 40 of us on here, so you can just unmute and talk if you'd like to do that. Or raise your hand and I'll recognize you. Yeah, Cassidy, go for it.
Hi, this is Cassidy. I'm a white female in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back into a messy bun for a work from home day. I have two large abstract pictures behind me, and other than that, it's pretty boring. To answer the question, what do you all know of related to transportation provided directly? The only experience I've had with this is during quarantine or COVID, when we had CARES Act funding and were able to get volunteers to give rides to vaccination clinics. I don't know the insides behind it, but I do know that we were given leeway in that area during that time. And it would have been great to have seen it continue as far as the volunteers that were interested and the success it had.
Thank you. I have seen both volunteer and paid drivers. So both of those are certainly options. Somebody's hand was up and now it's gone. There you are, Christina.
Hey, so we don't do a lot on transportation. We do more in the advocacy arena. But like the young lady previously said, during COVID, we used some of our CARES funding to assist individuals to get to those doctor appointments if they needed to. But when I started here back in 2003 under our then director, Deborah Cunningham, I had mentioned the idea of, hey, there's this money out here for transportation. And she always would say that there's no emergencies in the IL and that we would make them more dependent on us by providing the transportation. And that would go against our philosophy. So I never mentioned it again.
Well, that's an interesting perspective. So let's talk about that for just a minute, because I think it's an interesting one to look at and to think about in your planning as a center. This whole issue of, do we create dependency or don't we? And what is and is not good IL. And certainly you have the right at the local level to make decisions about what that means to you. You know your community, you know what your city and county are willing to do or not willing to do. But the reality is that public transportation is a legitimate municipal service that is provided to everybody who needs it, whether they have a disability or not. So it's provided to other people who don't drive, don't have a vehicle, only have one vehicle, and 5 people need to go 5 different directions. And so 4 of them have to use public transit while the other one uses the car. There are lots of reasons why transportation is a tool for independence, or can be. So it's really interesting, I think, to take the time to examine that philosophy a little bit more deeply. Because it's certainly not it's not simple, and it's not so simple as to say, oh, we don't want to create dependence, therefore we will not do transportation, because it's like saying, oh, we won't provide wheelchairs because we don't want people to be dependent on adaptive equipment. It's not dependency, it's a piece of freedom. Do you see what I mean? Just a second, Cassie, let me read Leanne's comment and then I'll get yours. So Leanne says, Aloha Independent Living Hawaii started their transportation program on the Big Island, initially through CARES Act, which several of you have mentioned, to fund it through various grants. They provide on-demand direct paratransit for consumers, and right now they only have funding for 1 van and 1 driver, but it's been highly successful and much needed. Cassidy, you had a comment or a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to address the dependency portion of transportation. Something that we do right now, regardless, is teach the skills that are available based on the needs of the person. So whether that's prepping for a driver's license exam, figuring out how to budget for a vehicle and insurance, so adding that into the scope, signing up for my mind is blanking, for services that are available and navigating the system, and also the public bus system. And also, side note, dittoing everything Paula said, those things aren't available to everywhere and to everyone. So I definitely agree with that point, that this is a way to provide independence, not as much holding someone back from learning a skill available.
Okay, thanks, Cassidy. Joseph, you had a comment or a question?
Yeah, if I'm wrong, Paula, you can just shut my screen off and, and go the connection here. But this is Joseph from Life and Center for Independent Living. I was kind of thinking about that. Was it Cassie? Yeah, or Cassidy, sorry. That comment that was made about how we're enabling rather than empowering. And Paula had made a great comment regarding, like, it's kind of a decision that has to be made on the ground level. Each CIL is going to be a little different. The communities are going to be a little bit different. I mean, I was just talking to Jessica from Nickel today about self-direction, right? And she's like, oh, Massachusetts has a great self-direction program. And I'm like, well, I can't really take Massachusetts self-direction to Idaho legislators because they're not going to care, because it's Massachusetts and Idaho, right? Completely different demographics and needs and rurality and all that stuff. One thing I will add is I think that a way as Centers for Independent Living, we can kind of like gauge how we're going to either empower or enable, because there are some times where, if we're not careful, we can enable consumers and do things for them rather than with them. But I think you have to ask yourself, how well is this going to help this individual achieve the ability to do the 5 core services, or how well are we going to be able to help them with the 5 core services via this? So if you adding transportation or personal assistance services or whatever fee for service it may be, if you can see that effectively helping your consumers better have the ability to participate or do the 5 core services, then I'd say it's probably empowering.
Yeah, good way to look at it. If you look at your community and you ask yourself, okay, is it small enough? And do people live close enough to the things that they need and want to see that transportation is not needed? It might be. We served an 18 county area in Northwest Kansas when I was there. They expanded it later to include more. 16,000 square miles. Okay. And not every community needed transportation in town, because they were some of them very small communities. And if you lived anywhere in town, you could get to anywhere in town. You could get to the grocery store, unless you were physically not able to do that. And of course, today that grocery store will deliver. So we've also resolved some of those issues of what you need transportation for. So you have some of your medical appointments are done by Zoom, or some of your, other needs are met in other ways. But in some communities, it really is difficult to get around and get to what you need to see, regardless of the size. So whether it's rural or urban, it's hard to find transportation to the places you need to go. Now, the comment that Christina's boss made about there are no emergencies in IL, I just want to scream, frankly, because people have emergencies. And when people have emergencies, they need ways to resolve the issues. And if the only way they can resolve that issue is to call mom, how have we encouraged their independence? If the way that they can resolve the issue is accessing the same transportation that anyone else in the community might need to access, then how is that a positive thing, right? So you see where I'm coming from, as far as sometimes it makes sense to somehow be involved in making sure that transportation happens. Now, Matthew commented that in the chat that everyone in our society is dependent on someone or something. We just live in a culture that considers dependence on public transportation, as an example, to be normal, but dependence on something like an assistive device or a caregiver to be abnormal. But we all have ways in which our life requires support. We've talked some in the field about whether independent living is really the term that we want to use, Because what does independent mean? And independent means living, having the independence to live the way you want to live. Not to do it without anybody's assistance, not to do it without adaptive equipment, but to do it with the necessary supports and assistance from society to make it possible for you to do it. And I think transportation, like I said, from the beginning has been something that we've had to think about and work on because there are transportation needs that people have. And we have to think about, what does that look like? Is it Greyhound? Is it Uber? Maybe. Is it something a center might want to do? Maybe. You need to think about it as far as what makes sense for your community and what your community is telling you they want and need. I got to listen to them too, as part of that.
I
Let's
would
talk-
also,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
sorry, are we okay to talk out like that, Paula, or should I be raising my hand?
No, you're okay to talk out like
All
that.
right, sorry, this is Joseph again. That's a really good point you bring up too. And like, I look at, we work a lot with our CILs in our state. I'm sure you guys do, but like I meet regularly with the Link and the DAC folks here in Idaho. And like, it is all so different. I mean, we in Southeastern Idaho cover an area the size of South Carolina, like, and we're very relatively small cells. So then you got people like Link who have Nampa, Boise, and Meridian, the three biggest cities in Idaho, like right here. And so their demographic looks completely different on how they might set up transportation versus us. So anyway.
And that's a reality for centers, but it's also one of the interesting strengths of the way that the Rehab Act was written is that it doesn't tell you what each one of those core services has to look like in your community. You get to decide that. And so sometimes people will ask me, well, what is independent living skills and how is it done? And I ask them, well, what do you want it to be? And what are your people telling you that it should be when you look at it? Because the reality is that it's written loosely enough or open enough that you get to decide what fits your community with each one of those services. And that includes the role for the optional services, of which transportation is one. So we have the right to take a look at all the different things that make sense or don't make sense. Now, I don't know if your center wants to provide direct transportation services. I do know, without a doubt, that you have a role in advocating for transportation. Because there is something in your community. Maybe it's Uber. And maybe one of the ways you're going to advocate for transportation is you're going to offer to train those Uber drivers on how to provide transportation to people with disabilities in certain ways. So it may involve how to fold up a wheelchair because they got no idea. And when they see that person that they're picking up, they think, oh no, they would pick up their suitcase in a heartbeat, but they don't know how to pick up that wheelchair once the person transfers into their vehicle. So maybe helping the people that you provide services to know how to provide that training to the providers of transportation in the community. Maybe that's part of what you do. So you help Joe, who's, using a wheelchair, to know how to find the right drivers, build his own group of, small group of drivers, provide them with the training they need to provide him with the support that he needs so that that can happen. So advocacy can happen on that one-to-one basis, or it can happen on a bigger basis. So who's serving on the transportation council right now for the city or the county? There ought to be somebody with disabilities on that council. It doesn't have to be staff from the center. It can be somebody who needs and uses transportation. And you can help advocate to make sure that that actually happens. So Catherine says in the chat, our individual still provides disability sensitivity training to new transit drivers for our 2 county mass transit organizations. Successful partnership provides us a fee for service. And I see that here in Fresno too. The Center for Independent Living here actually provides training to the drivers, to the new drivers. And they also provide to the consumers the option to go get on a van or a bus, depending on what they're using, and mark their wheelchair where the tie downs should go, so that it's simpler for the driver to know how to secure that rider without being afraid, right? So how do we make that happen? Well, we can go to the city, go to the county, do it through the council where we have people on the board and say, you know, here's something that the drivers need and the riders need, and let's see how we can do it. And actually help people to tie down that wheelchair. Now, I don't know how many of you have tied down a wheelchair in an unfamiliar vehicle. I have, and it scares me to death. Because the last thing I want is for that wheelchair to tip over. And if you don't have it tied in enough places, it can. If you have to hit your brakes, turn a corner too fast, you know, the whole thing can go over if you don't do it right. And sometimes the drivers of the paratransits are scared to death. They really don't know what to do. And one of your advocacy roles is to help them identify that as an issue and provide training to them, and you can get paid to do it. So you're doing your advocacy, but you're also getting a fee for service for making sure that it happens. That's true with the tie downs, and also the lift itself sometimes has peculiarities. They're not all the same.
They're all different. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like we
They
had
order the next one and it's different than the last one. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, every tie down that I've ever done with a wheelchair is like all different.
Well, what happened here is that the city agreed that the tie downs that they were putting in place were the same. And then they allowed us to use one of their vehicles and actually go in and help the individual who's going to ride that paratransit or that transit to mark their chair for where it goes, and teach the rider how to teach the driver how to tie them down, so that the rider is in control and saying, no, you need to put this tie down on this tire, and you need to secure it this way, you know, and I have to have my brakes on, but also you have to have ABC. And it really is a very appropriate thing for a center to do, right? Increases the ability of the person to be in control of their life through the transportation. So, and I know that you all have experienced this if you have public transportation, and that is riders being passed by. I've heard stories of Uber and Lyft drivers who pull up, take one look and say, "Oh, I don't want to deal with that." And they leave and they don't do the ride. Joseph, you have a comment or a question on that?
I just have a question, and I'm sorry, no, I'm talking a lot, but
No.
I'm curious, Paula, to pick your brain on this. As far as transportation services across the country goes, like, do you typically have do you see more programs that are reimbursed by like Medicaid, Medicare, or do you see more programs that are reimbursed by grant funding?
We see grant funding, we see Medicare, Medicaid for medical transportation or medically related transportation, including non-emergency medical transportation, so to and from doctor's offices. And we see city and county money being designated because that's an appropriate transportation, is an appropriate city or county service. So
Okay.
we see it from them as well. We see
Would you
some centers using their Title VII funds, and that's also allowable. It's an allowable expense under the grants.
would you say it's about 50-50, or is it
Well, that's a
mostly?
good question. I don't know. The
But it's a
biggest
good
money,
proportion.
yeah, the biggest money is in the non-emergency medical transportation because they pay a pretty good rate once you're approved.
Uh,
And then you can
thank,
keep adding vehicles.
thank you.
Mhm. So comments or questions about transportation as you see it in your community? Are you involved in looking at those transportation plans? Now, there are other areas you probably also should be involved, like housing, the development of housing. I just had a conversation with a center director, and they had been involved at the beginning in this housing development and the requirement for it to be, requirement for it to be accessible, the new housing to be, all the common areas accessible, a percentage of the apartments accessible, and so forth. And then they rolled the plans out at the planning council, and none of it was in there. We got to be on these councils. We got to have a voice. Yeah, Christina.
So two things. One of the ways here in Memphis, which is where we're located, that we're involved in transportation, is we typically go to the public transit board meetings, and we get feedback from riders of paratransit a lot. That they're not able to make reservations 3 days in advance. They can only make it on the third day. They can't make it on the second or the day before. And so we know that we've got capacity constraints within our public transit system. So we've been doing different surveys to kind of try to gauge that, to possibly look at then more systemic advocacy in the forms of a civil rights complaint. So I was kind of curious to see what other approaches other CILs did to kind of to do that. And then the second question I really had was in terms of Uber and Lyft. I serve on a local advisory board for citizens with disabilities. And sometimes I've heard, well, Lyft and Uber, of course, their drivers are by contract. So a lot of them don't have wheelchair accessible vehicles. Do you pass an ordinance requiring that to, for Uber and Lyft or shared ride, whatever they call it?
Yeah.
And sometimes that bites your nose for your face because it does provide a valuable service for those who can't take it. So I was just kind of curious to see if any other CILs are dabbling in those areas and what results they've had. Because the only one I've ever heard of was in Austin. And I think from what I heard, they pulled out of Austin. So
Yeah, I think that Uber and Lyft are a huge value to the community. Blind and visually impaired individuals, people who use walkers, people who use manual wheelchairs can utilize those vehicles without there being specialized equipment in the vehicle, right? They can transfer and so forth. The problems have been that the Lyft drivers themselves will not always pick people up. They see a service animal and they don't want to take the risk. And I had a good friend whose dog was attacked by the driver, and the dog was very well behaved, a trained service dog. The person was blind, so not sure what was going on at first, right? And the driver actually, it appears, attacked the dog with a knife and to get him out. So he was kind of advocating for himself. Well, no, you can let me in. My service dog is allowed, da 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 da. And the driver response was horrible. Now, when you see these driver responses, what I usually suggest to people is find the driver. Now, that won't work when you're out of town in a new place. But when you're in town, find your driver. Find that person that knows you, knows that your service dog is safe, knows how to fold up your wheelchair and put it in the trunk, will allow you, or your walker or whatever, will allow you to be a part of it and work with that driver, or 2 drivers or 3 drivers, but find drivers that you can contact and ask to come and get you, and you have a driver you can trust. So with Uber and Lyft, and with taxis, if you still have them in your community, that seems to me to be the best activity. Anthony said one board member who uses a wheelchair has been turned away by Uber and Lyft once they see his chair, and that's true. One of the things that they assume is, I can't get that chair in my car. And they don't understand that some chairs fold up and go in the trunk. Or some of them don't understand that, right? So you have to have that conversation with them, put it in the comments when the reservation is made. Say, I can show you how to fold it up. it's lightweight, you know, it's only 22 pounds and it fits in the trunk. And you can actually see that something happens to educate the driver, but also to develop your cadre of drivers you can trust. So you just keep working on it. Joseph said if we required everybody to have accessible vehicles, drivers would probably disappear. They wouldn't understand if there was an incentive to do that. You have to educate and incentivize. Good point. There probably are some that have accessible vehicles, but that may be where your paratransit has to step in. It may be that if your chair is not something you can get out of as part of your transportation, then you may want to think about whether the public transit is what you need. Other comments or questions about any of this? I'm going to turn off the recording. Oh, I made a mistake. Hold on. Let me put this back up for just a second, share that screen just a second more for the last bit here. And that is, I didn't go into dispatch services much. I mentioned them in passing. You need to kind of keep that in mind and be involved in assuring access. I have my contact information in the presentation, and it's also found in the links. And then here's the evaluation survey, and we'll post it again at the end of the call. But we do ask that you evaluate these calls and give us feedback, both on this content and on what other content you'd like to see, and whether or not you feel like what we're offering is useful to you. So Joey's also posted this in the link in the chat, so you can take a look at that. And now